Welcome to this new episode. In this video, we will be talking about ancient skepticism. Ancient skepticism, a fascinating journey into critical thinking, emerges as a philosophical paradigm of paramount importance in the context of Greek and Roman thought, challenging certainties and stimulating doubt. Its historical emergence is part of an era of profound cultural transformations, in which the pre-existing grand philosophical narratives show their limits of interpretation. In this scenario, skepticism proposes a method of inquiry that undermines the traditional paradigms of knowledge, introducing an element of reflexivity and methodological doubt that is configured as constitutive with respect to the philosophical systems that preceded it. Far from being a mere negation of the possibility of knowledge, skepticism presents itself as a rigorous investigation into the conditions of possibility and the structural limits of cognitive experience. The figure of Pyrrho of Elis stands as a cornerstone in the genealogy of skepticism. His thinking develops in the Hellenistic context, marked by a growing complexity in intellectual and cultural relations. Pyrrho observes how the different philosophical schools produce arguments that appear equally plausible, despite being inherently contradictory, and comes to the conclusion that absolute truth is inaccessible to the human intellect. This observation does not imply an abandonment of the search for truth, but rather a profound revision of the ways in which this search is conducted. The concept of epoch, suspension of judgment, assumes an absolute centrality in his reflection. Epoch is not configured as a form of epistemological nihilism or a renunciation of rationality, but rather as a philosophical strategy that implies the suspension of definitive judgment, by virtue of the recognition of the impossibility of establishing univocal and incontrovertible criteria of truth. This approach determines a radical transformation of the philosophical attitude, which renounces the claims of absolute certainty in favor of a dimension of openness and continuous problematization. Epoché is configured, therefore, as a preliminary condition for a more cautious form of philosophical inquiry, aware of its own limits. Skeptical critique is articulated through a sophisticated system of argumentative tropes, which systematically question the possibility of achieving certain and unquestionable knowledge. Skeptics develop a complex strategy of deconstructing dogmatic claims, showing how every cognitive statement is exposed to the possibility of a symmetrical and equally strong counter-argument. The use of tropes is not configured as a rhetorical exercise in itself, but as a rigorous method to unmask the intrinsic weaknesses of claims to absolute truth. The main areas of skeptical critical inquiry concern the nature of sensory perceptions and their relative reliability, highlighting the variability and subjectivity of sensory experience, the interpretative processes and their intrinsic subjectivity, showing how every interpretation is conditioned by individual cultural and historical factors. The historical and cultural conditions that determine the construction of knowledge, emphasizing how knowledge is always situated and relative to a specific context. The skeptical methodology is not limited to a sterile negation or a mere exercise of intellectual demolition, but proposes a dynamic and processual form of knowledge, in which doubt is not conceived as an insurmountable obstacle, but as an indispensable tool of philosophical inquiry. Doubt, in this perspective, becomes the engine of a continuous and inexhaustible research, aimed at overcoming dogmatic rigidities and promoting a more complex and articulated vision of reality. Historically, skepticism is articulated in different traditions, among which stand out Pyrrhonian skepticism, characterized by a more radical and anti-dogmatic approach, and academic skepticism, which is more inclined to recognize degrees of cognitive probability. Despite the differences in emphasis, both traditions share a common philosophical core based on the critique of claims to absolute truth and the valorization of a methodologically open and flexible approach. In addition to the epistemological dimension, skepticism proposes a specific ethical perspective which is based on the search for Ataraxia, that is, inner tranquility. Ataraxia is not achieved through the acquisition of definitive and unquestionable truths, but through the ability to suspend judgments and accept the complexity and uncertainty inherent in the human condition. This attitude implies a form of liberation from dogmatic anxieties and uncontrolled passions, promoting a willingness to listen and interpret that transforms doubt from a paralyzing obstacle into a cognitive tool and a key to a serene and conscious life. The legacy of ancient skepticism extends far beyond the chronological boundaries of its origin, exerting a significant influence on the development of Western thought. Skepticism represents a fundamental epistemological model for the birth and evolution of the scientific method, for modern theories of knowledge, and for contemporary critical epistemologies, which question the conditions of possibility and the limits of scientific knowledge. Its ability to problematize preconceived knowledge and to question established certainties retains an extraordinary relevance, offering even today a rigorous, stimulating and fertile philosophical perspective to face the challenges of the contemporary world. Thank you for watching. See you next time. See.